do a quick roll call. I know
Sure.
that may be a little bit annoying, but it lets me make sure I don't miss anybody.
Sure.
So Carol Westlake.
I'm here.
Lori Smith.
Here.
Stephen Smith.
Here.
Andrea Edwards.
Here.
David Martin.
Here.
Lynette Porter.
Here.
Jennifer Apria.
Here.
Leanne Simmerman.
Here.
Mandy Fisher. Ann Thornstein.
Here.
Wendy Tucker. Senator Powers. And Representative Whitson.
Here.
All right. That is everybody.
Perfect. Well, that's good. We definitely have a quorum. Again, thanks everybody for participating. I know Anna was just talking about there's a lot of statewide chatter already about this. I think there was actually front page on the Tennessean today. For those of you that see the Tennessean, was discussion points around the education conversation with funding. So I appreciate everybody jumping back on. I know a lot of folks are busy. Ginger, you want to pull up maybe our charge again for us, and we'll kind of jump into that, and then I'll cover a few things there. If you want to go ahead and kick us off with kind of our charge and just reminders about some of what we have been doing and the expectation as we move forward.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll jump in with our statement. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. The conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to comment openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. I think we've taken care of several of these already.
Yeah. Yeah, we're making pretty good time, and we've done all of that in about 6 minutes.
Excellent. So I'll zip through these really quickly, just reminding you guys to pull on that expertise that you all bring to this conversation. I know we aren't getting all of the things out as quickly as we'd like to be able to get those out to you. So that's something that we are working on. I shared with a few of you all earlier in the conversation before everybody was on. So I want to repeat that for the group, that for today's conversation, you do not need to have looked at all of that public feedback that I emailed you about yesterday. That is something that we'll bring into the conversation more in meeting 4. Some of you got a good head start on that already, but it's not something that you have to feel pressure about for today's conversation, but it is something that we'll definitely bring into meeting 4. And then there will be other deliveries of the public comment moving forward. So today's will still be focused on what you are able to bring to the table from conversations that you're having with organizations that you're involved in, individual conversations you've had with people, and then that expertise that you bring to the group. And we would also like to just encourage you over the next 4 weeks to really push in on your community organizations, asking them for feedback, asking them to submit that to that dedicated email address so that we do have public record of those things so that we can share that back out with all of the subcommittees so everyone can take that into consideration. So it's super helpful for them to share that with you and you can bring it back to this subcommittee, but it's also helpful to have that record in that email address. So then it gets shared out with all of us. So all 18 of the subcommittees. So if, as you're having those conversations, encourage people to send that to that dedicated email address as well. And I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to this part, Brad, before I move to the next one.
No, I think that's pretty good. We'll kind of get some of this knocked out, and then we'll probably experience a little bit of a pivot, kind of how we have been doing things and some of the things that Ginger and I have been talking about, but other areas have been contributing as well. So I'll let you go ahead and wrap this portion up and then kind of kick us all. I'll kick us off into the discussion 3.
Excellent. Okay, so this is, again, kind of speaking to the other things that we've talked about already, which is just bringing your expertise around what those needs for students are, which means you do not have to be a school funding expert to engage in this conversation. So we're really focusing on what are those needs for students and how we think about that from that student-based perspective. So as you think about that, we really want to, for today's conversation, we'll be focusing more on what are those things we want to consider for base, for weight, for additional funding, for outcomes, and then where do those fall within the must-have, should-haves, nice-to-haves, and so on. And so that's really where our focus will be today, and you just leveraging your expertise to really engage in that conversation.
Perfect, Ginger, and I appreciate that. And again, if you haven't, as Ginger said, no harm, no foul right now on not being able to review some of the documents. I would challenge you if you can this week or even next week to start looking at that. And just to kind of reset a little bit about where we're headed, one of the things that Ginger and I and other subcommittee chairs have been discussing, obviously given their assignment and their responsibility, that they're seeing a little bit in our group, but also in other groups too, that I think we need to really challenge ourselves to be careful. And I think it's natural for us to do it, is almost a tunnel vision approach of saying, hey, this impacts me, which means it's got to impact everybody else. And they're really starting to have to narrow down some of the things that are really universal considerations. So as we're going through this, good example of that, that we want shared, but again, it's not necessarily going to be something that's going to be part of the overall discussion on funding, is schools that don't follow like the IEP guidance that parents agree to. That's a challenge. That's something that needs to be addressed. That's something schools need to be held accountable for. It's not entirely tied into a funding mechanism or why the BEP needs to be looked at differently. So as we're going through some of this consolidation and as we review things, just maybe challenge ourselves a little bit around ideas that we're bringing up that are enterprise-wide impacts around funding for students with disabilities. I think some of the things might be school nurses. That's a statewide impact. That's not just unique to our child. That's an impact on all students. So just some things to think about, because as we've started to go through that, Commissioner Schwinn has been listening, has been paying attention. This leadership at DOE has been paying attention to these discussions inside the subcommittees. And that's kind of a trend that was starting to emerge, was they were getting, 100 ideas around what needs to be better, and 50 of them might have been about BEP funding and how do we make funding more equitable. So you can kind of understand their positions around why it's important for us to have conversations about funding, and maybe separating some of those areas that are not directly impacted by funding, but are things that need to be considered down the road for discussion about how do we continue to incorporate, include, rethink how we do education for every student across the state, and not just students that are impacted by our subcommittee. So please keep those ideas coming. Just understand when you see Ginger submitting those, and we might see, a lot of the things that we put forward are not in the final plan. That's not done maliciously. There's a theme and a reason behind that, and it's got to be tied directly to universal school funding across the state of Tennessee as the governor's office, the Department of Education, and the legislature start moving forward on that. So, Ginger, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that. I know that was something you and I were covering, but I was just going to say, if it kind of ties into that, we might want to move to the next slide to really give some background and basis on what we have been seeing as requests that are very universal. And that's just funding doesn't change. Like whatever the new funding might look like, the BEP funding might look like, it doesn't need to be less than what we're currently getting. So a couple of these things, I'll let you guys review this screen as we've been talking about it. A lot of it you've probably already have seen, is general messaging that's coming across from other subcommittees and other stakeholders across the state. And one of the things that's really unique to this slide that I think impacts us, and Ginger, you're going to have to help me. I don't want to misspeak on this given that it's public, but as we've been receiving feedback from across the state, the number 2 or number 3 point of concern from folks has been spending for students with disabilities. So there is good traction in other areas of the state, in other subcommittees, other invested educators, stakeholders across the board, who recognize that there's been challenges with how do we educate students with disabilities, and a lot of that is centered around funding. So knowing that, I think it's pretty healthy for us to read what's been requested, but also keep that in mind that we've really got an attentive audience around students with disabilities, to identify areas that we can really allocate some dollars, because there's feedback around that. I also want to be equally clear and transparent that just because that's happening doesn't mean that there's not space for gifted conversations. But the gifted conversations have, I think, been kind of segmented away from and segregated from the conversations around students with disabilities. I've talked to several committee members that we have on this committee and some other committee members saying that people bring that up, but there's almost a consideration of, well, students with disabilities fall over here and gifted students fall over here and they're okay. I mean, really stuff that we've talked about. So again, keep that in mind as we're talking about direct funding. I think one of the things that was a takeaway for me in the early meeting was, hey, we really need to reincorporate back a gifted education leadership team in the Department of Education. That is a funding conversation, I think, that's appropriate to take place. But when we start trickling down to say, well, you know, we need to have something that might be for gifted students that's not necessarily tied to funding, be very careful in how we approach that one as a must-have versus, hey, this would be a nice to have. So everybody on this is smart enough and mature enough to understand. And I see you just raised your hand. I'll stop for a second, give you a second to comment before we move on.
One thing I just want to be careful of outside of our committee is for people to understand that IEP does not always equal all of disability, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure that we're other committees that don't understand the nuances, that some kids who have epilepsy, diabetes, you know, other things can be in a 504, even with dyslexia can be under our state dyslexia law. So
Yep.
Just as we're communicating that out for people who don't understand the nuance in disability, I want to make sure that all students with disabilities are incorporated and not just those who've met that IEP threshold.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, because the extension of that, Carol, I'll jump to you right here in a second. The extension of that, and I think what they were asking was, hey, we're happy to have all conversations, but understand if you bring it up, there's got to be some sort of funding model tied to that about, okay, why do you want to spend dollars on this? What is the benefit for the state to say, we're going to invest in 100 new special education teachers? You know, that's an investment part. I think what was happening in some of the other meetings, Anna, to be quite frank, was we had parents bringing up saying, hey, schools need to follow the IEP for my child. That might be right, but that's not necessarily tied into, okay, how does that help us look at overall funding for state dollars? You see what I'm saying there? So there was a bit of a blend there that I committed to to Ginger and some others that, hey, I would bring up to our team to make sure they understand if we bring it up, there's got to be a funding reason why that's important to this subcommittee too. Hey, Carol, go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, and I
Sure.
really appreciate that comment by Anna, because I do think that when you think about funding in special education, you know, or kids with kids with disabilities, people think about special education, think about the federal kinds of supplements that come in.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just really do need to be conscious with everyone, I think, that disability doesn't equal special education.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I really was interested in sort of putting a pin in that third bullet on the PowerPoint, because I think that that's especially critical for kids with disabilities and kids who are gifted or high needs kids in general. You know, we think about teacher ratios, we think about things, but we've been talking about some of the other things in this committee. And, you know, I just learned the other day that speech language therapists and audiologists are not in the
Not
BEP. Who knew?
Yep.
I didn't, apparently. You know, and that school is a bunch of things beyond teachers and instruction. And I think that's just a really important point that we all keep in mind, that if you're going to do something, as you say, Brad, that is universal about school funding, that it needs to be universal. Do you know, as opposed to picking apart things for later that we're going to do something about. So
yeah, no, it's a good point, because those are the things that Ginger and I are able to advocate for, to say, listen, this is not just funding that benefits students that might fall in our population. There might be some students that do need a little bit of assistance more with a speech therapist who historically might not have qualified or had an IEP like my child. So those are the things I think Ginger would agree with too. Like, there's an idea around funding, Carol, that we can tie to that, to say it'd be really good if therapists were included in education funding, and here's why: mental health, behavioral, you know, all those things. I think you're getting at a universal type conversation about, yeah, that makes sense to be part of an education model as we're looking at funding. Hey, David, go ahead. I just saw your hand pop up.
Thanks. Yeah, for sure. I echo sort of what Carol said about the things that are not funded through the BEP, because in talking with my colleagues, other directors of schools, those are huge expenses that are bared by the district. And one of the things that happens too, when because you have so many positions that are not funded through the BEP, then when subsequent pay increases or things like that come through, those are unfunded through the BEP. So if the money's passed through the BEP for like teacher pay increases, those unfunded positions don't get the same funding at that point. So then local dollars and school district dollars have to come up. And I do want to sort of hit on the first point, the requested district, you know, not to receive less BEP funding. I mean, I think the whole thing is, and I think if you look at it, our per pupil expenditure is far lower than most every state in the country. And so we can talk about dicing the pie up, but unless the pie grows, we're going to have significant struggles within our public schools. And so I think it's really important that we advocate for more funding, not just slice the pie up differently, but making sure that we bake a bigger pie.
Yeah, good point. And just in case you did not read the front page of the Tennessean, that was the exact, almost verbatim language that was used, was, you know, we're not just asking for status quo here. If we're looking at all of it, let's look at all of it to figure out, how do we make a bigger pie? And if there's opportunities to do that, what does that look like? And I think, David, that really gets to the core of what their expectation is for us as a committee, to say, hey, tell us where we need to be spending dollars. And if that means sometimes, to your point, saying, hey, here's where we really need to invest even more dollars because of a better return, I think that's all part of the conversation too. Jen, I saw your hand come up.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to jump in after what David said, because that is so important, that the pie is also created to be bigger within the base of the student formula, if it's going to be student focused. I was looking over the materials, and one of the things that was shared for this meeting from, I guess it was the Texas Education Association or agency, it had mentioned something about performance-based bonuses. And I think across the board, in particular for students with disabilities, but just across the board, it's really not the best idea to base any kind of pay or teacher incentive on student performance or student outcomes in that way, especially if it's test-based, because you won't be able to get the high scores required to get those incentives out of some of the students that are just trying to meet their IEP goals. They're not necessarily going to perform well on a standardized test. And so I don't know, as a request, and maybe an added bullet point, is that the funding is built within the base with weights for certain needs the students have, and that there's not a separate bonus or incentive system that may put some students at a disadvantage.
Yep. That you know, it's interesting you said that, because I was just going back. I received an email from, and I think she's a teacher at one of our schools here in Middle Tennessee. And she was basically saying very similar to what you just said, Jen. I was trying to scramble to read it while you were, you know, if you fund it, they'll come. Like, if you have dollars available for parents and for students and for opportunities, people will find ways to fill that gap so their child can participate. And it was a great, very basic point, but really I think hits to the core of that is, we talk about being serious, but the dollars we invest in it, I think will really drive home that point about here's how serious we are type stuff. So really good feedback there. And I appreciate so much the honesty that everyone here is sharing. Director Smith is on here. Stephen and I have a great relationship, and he has come from an education background, and he has shared, historically some things that they saw at DOE and things that we can learn from that about what matters and feedback they've gotten. And, Representative Whitson has been there. We all have segments of community that we're involved in that have a history here about why it worked or why it didn't work. And we certainly, to your point, David, we don't want to reinvent the wheel and call it something new. If we're just recycling this, it might not help all of us. But we need to be honest about looking at it to say, hey, where has the BEP worked and why change that portion if it has worked? But areas that we can see some improvement on, what is that going to look like? So all really good points. I appreciate feedback. Again, if you guys have comments to add, raise your hand and I will certainly stop to make sure we do that. So Ginger, do you mind moving on to kind of the next slide? If everybody's had a chance to look at that, this is, again, some of the base pieces of conversation that we've talked about of the must-haves. I'm not leaving the room until it gets it, the nice-to-haves, the maybe-haves. We wanted to create that base, and a lot of what you see on here has been a base model that others have shared too around pay and psychologists for children's behavioral needs and mental health challenges and nurses and counselors. We've got to really start to zero in on areas that we universally agree on. I can't speak, I don't want to put words in Ginger's mouth, but I think when we looked at the list from last meeting, there was probably 20 or 25 different ideas. We need to start going through them. So I'm hoping that you guys have all had a chance to review the notes that Ginger sent out. And again, I want to publicly thank Ginger for her patience with us and her diligence in the notes and getting it out to us in a timely manner. Thank you. So we need to start really trimming down some of that. Just so you know, you'll start probably seeing some of those ideas, not necessarily ideas per se, some of the comments that were made about, hey, this is a must-have or nice to have, that is part of a non-funding related idea. Those will start being stripped away. Please don't take that as personal where we pick up our toy. Again, it just goes back to what I said 10 minutes ago. We're being asked to focus now on funding only and what could really be a universal conversation around funding, like nurses, like psychologists, like therapists that need to be involved in schools. You can see on Ginger's screen there, she's actually emailing us as we speak. If you guys want to pull that up, I think it'll be beneficial for us to maybe go through some of that and again, try to have that conversation about what are the ones that we're absolutely all of us will march on the Capitol, so to speak, if it's not included in a must-have. So Ginger, if you maybe want to move to the next page for me, if there is a next page. I saw you look up real quick with the panic in your eye, so I hope there is a next page. Yeah, there we go. The weights, go to the weights page.
1 second before we move to
Sure.
the weights page. As we move through today's meeting, I definitely want to make sure that I capture from you guys how you want me to put forth the list of here are the must-haves for base, weights, additional funding, and outcomes. So what does that full list look like? And then what do those nice-to-haves and those should-haves for each of these categories? So as you're going through this, kind of be thinking through that, so we can circle back and really put a list together for what that looks like. And I apologize for having to send that to you in an email. For some reason, and I had the same issue when Brad and I were on a call the other day, I don't have the paperclip to actually share an attachment in the chat today. So I had to email that to you. So I do apologize for you having to scramble to your email to look at that.
Yeah, no problem. And if you, all good feedback. And again, thanks for saying. So some of the weighted areas here, if you look at this, these, I mean, are lining up with areas that receive the most feedback from across the state about areas that we need to focus on really as the must-have. And again, These are from across the state. That's not a prerequisite to say if you've got something outside of these 7, don't bring it up. That's not the point. But there is a universal theme here, I think, that you can see that emerge because these top 3, and David, obviously, being superintendent in East Tennessee, can speak to the rural area and the sparsity and some of the challenges that they have too. These were pretty overwhelmingly the top 3 to 5, I think, across the state that really kind of helped us zone in. And then I think to Carol's earlier comment, what's important for us is the tiers that are based on the cost to provide services, that each child is different. Is there opportunities for money to move with the child instead of just saying, here's a blunt, here's a dollar amount that we think it's going to cost to educate a child? Is there ways to move those dollars with children? And again, you read down at the bottom a little bit, areas that didn't receive as much feedback, gifted, dyslexia, K through, class size. There were a lot of different areas there. But I think we really need to start having that conversation directly with the bullet point number 2 in students with disabilities, as we're moving. If you want to move to the next page there, Jen, going back and looking at what we shared last week, and then creating those types of tiers to say, hey, what are the ones that we're going to die on a hill on? What are the ones, again, that we think would be a nice to have, and allow Ginger to really start adding that to the list, and probably towards the end of this month or next month, we have to make some decisions on what our final, because I only think, Ginger, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we have 3 more meetings and that's it, which means we really need to start moving forward. And probably that last meeting, hopefully, is us all saying how much we enjoyed spending time with each other and looking forward to the exciting changes. But so I would say we need to have this done by no later than 2 meetings from now. And today will, I think, be a big part of that. Anna, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
So I'm just confused on where we are. So the additional dollars, it's base, then weight, then additional dollars. Is that what this slide is?
Yeah, so it is. So I'll let Ginger kind of talk about that too a little bit. So what happened?
I need help with acronyms.
Yeah, right. And I'm also in the world where everything is an acronym, which drives me nuts because I'm trying to have to figure that out. So let me set a high level point of conversation and let Ginger really dive into that. So what they've started to do is the Department of Education, they're taking the statewide feedback and the feedback that they're also getting in the town halls and the subcommittees. They have created that grouping to say, wow, here's the overwhelming areas that we're seeing concern about funding or requests for funding or conversation around funding. And then there's also those conversation areas about, hey, additional funding, what might that look like? So I'll let Ginger kind of run with it from there because I don't want to get too far out of my lane in this group.
Okay, so Anna, is your question specifically about the acronyms you're seeing on this slide, or do you want me to go back to?
I was wondering just what CTE and IHS.
Okay, perfect. So CTE is career and technical education. So looking at how we expand career and technical education to the middle schools, whether it just be exploring career and technical education there or actually expanding programming into the middle grades. For IHS is innovative high schools. So how are we thinking about having models in high school that give students additional innovative opportunities to engage in high school coursework, also engaging in other opportunities that could be with employers and that sort of thing at the high school. So thinking about school a little differently than our traditional methods. And then you all are well versed in RTI, so I don't think I have to talk through that one.
Yeah, so hopefully that helps, Ann. And again, it's the acronyms are, of course, they drive us all crazy, but it's also part of their filtering process to say, hey, we're starting to make traction on where we're seeing themes emerge. These are all part of areas of themes that have started to emerge from the very beginning and then now being incorporated into all the town halls, all the subcommittees, everybody, having these conversations about, okay, let's start zeroing in on where we're being told this is areas of impact for us. So you want to move to the next screen for me, Ginger, if you don't mind. So again, this is pretty self-explanatory about these areas as far as outcomes. If you read through that again, number 1 was students with disabilities, students in poverty, very same themes about where we think as a state or the feedback from town hall, we need to invest our dollars. They're hoping, hey, this is also the area that we're hoping to see the most improvement. Now, what was really interesting too, when we're looking at this is you see AP course completion and or passing for all students or only for economic disadvantaged students, just as English learners. Historically, you have AP classes, people start thinking, well, that's really smart kids. That could be gifted kids. So funding requests for gifted students was really low at the bottom, but outcomes are really accelerated for students that historically have been in gifted classes or advanced learning classes, AP classes. So it's kind of interesting to see that. One of the ones that I think was really something that I think benefits our population was earning industry certificates or certifications. We have in my department selfishly, and with Stephen too, and TennCare and others, Carol knows about this, and so do other advocates, are working towards secondary and post-secondary opportunities for students with disabilities around equivalents for college degrees and certifications that would allow them to graduate and hold jobs and be considered for employment. It was kind of neat to see some of these things pop up because I think there are areas that funding could benefit every student, but are also areas that our students could benefit from if there's funding available for that. Then obviously the last one was, differentiated compensation support. I'm not going to act like I know what that is. I think I know what that is, but Ginger, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that? Because I know that's come up with teachers and we've talked about paying gifted teachers and special education teachers differently as well.
Yeah, I think what you just shared could be part of this. So
Yeah.
it is thinking about the different roles that teachers have, potentially paying them differently. It could also be, someone mentioned the performance pay piece earlier, that could be part of that. So it's just thinking about that differentiated pay and what could go into that.
Yeah. Yep. All good feedback. You want to move to the next one for me there, Ginger, please, if you don't mind. And then, yeah, so right here is kind of where we put pen to paper about must-have, should-haves, nice-to-haves, and then long shots. So if you don't mind looking at the document that Ginger, I read Jennifer on the screen on another screen I had, sorry, Ginger. If you don't mind pulling up that document, if you have not had the chance to pull it up, that Ginger just sent, it's around our meeting notes, the must-haves, the nice-to-haves. And again, it's okay to keep all of this the same. Just understand that some of those might be removed if they don't necessarily meet the criteria around the funding part. I want to stop for a second. If we can kind of go through the must-haves and see if there's any changes or any should-haves or nice-to-haves that you guys as a group feel passionate enough about to move up, and maybe some areas from the must-have that we need to move out of there. Because I think one of the things too we have to balance, and I don't want to lean on Ginger to put pressure on her, it's going to be very difficult, frankly, for us to go in with 18 must-haves. We're going to have to look at this list with a pretty open mind to say, listen, we can't, none of us said we need to move any of this. So I would challenge us to look at some of the must-haves to say, okay, man, that'd be awesome if we could get it, but that's not something that we need per se, that maybe that's a should have. One of the ones, again, not to point fingers or anything, but funding to support students with dyslexia. That's important, but that's a targeted segment there that might not impact a bunch of students that we know of, but it could impact more if they do more testing. So there are conversation pieces around that. Anna, go ahead.
Sure, I'm going to push back against that because there is a high need for RTI, and we know RTI primarily targets students with learning disabilities through that process, and 80% of people with disabilities have dyslexia. So you can see there that actually that is a very high number of people we're talking about dyslexia. And then we also do know that students with disabilities, the vast percentage of students with disabilities in Tennessee do have specific learning disabilities.
Yeah,
and so the biggest disability category. So I just want to make sure that when we're talking about this, dyslexia isn't separate from any of this.
Yeah.
So
let me
rewording and definitely adding and condensing some of it. But
I think the one thing I wanted to say, I meant to add to that before I was able to go to you, that will probably provide some context. it's not just removing it as it is, it's saying, but here's where we need the dollars to go for this. So we can't just go and say, we need money for dyslexia. Like, we need to be able to present to them, we need money for students with dyslexia that can then have dedicated resource. Like, there's got to be, like Ginger and I, we talked about this. We can't just go in saying, hey, we just need more money for students with dyslexia. We have to be able to share why or the what. So in that, what I was going to add to that was, we can keep it with characteristics of dyslexia outside of IEP by giving them specific intervention that will require therapists or dedicated resources. You see what I'm saying? And like, it's not saying, hey, dyslexia, we're just going to take that out because it was too generic. It's generic, but we need to add to it, and we can keep it in. So I didn't want, I laughed when I called on you. I was like, she's going to go crazy on me because I didn't get a chance to finish like why that matters. So
important, and we do have to add the why. And I did send an email to the group, specifically kind of tying that to the required interventions, and kind of did list out some ABCs of some specific language we can use based on what several other states are doing specifically around that.
Yeah, that's good. Hey, Carol, let me say one thing before I go to you, and Ginger, we're already at about 20 minutes till. One of the things that I am going to ask this group to do, because it's going to be hard given our time crunch today, I would ask you over the next week, and maybe even by next Tuesday, that you send your must-haves, or you review this and you get them to me and Ginger to say, I'm adamant that we keep this in there. So when we come back to the next meeting, we can say, okay, guys, 14 of our 16 said these must-haves got to stay in. So if we get to that point where only 7 of 16 say it's a must-have and the others say, well, that's a nice to have, those are conversations we need to start talking about where we move things to make it a little bit easier and fair for Ginger to submit these back, instead of just saying, we still have 18. We have to kind of start looking at that next week. So I would ask action items for all of you on here to, by next Tuesday, please send back to Ginger your must-haves, your nice-to-haves, your should-haves, and let's really focus in, even on Excel spreadsheet. Ginger, I guess that would be easier for you and me as we go through it. If you can add that to an Excel spreadsheet, maybe a must-have column, a nice-to-have column, and a should-have column, where we can start maybe coordinating that would be good for us to do, and give Ginger some grace there to say, hey, we're not going to make you have to do this again. Then when we come back in 2 weeks, we can talk about, here's what we know. Carol, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's interesting that Anna was right on RTI, because I was thinking about that, and I've begun to think about these must-haves and should-haves segmented by base and weight and right. I mean, so
sure.
And it occurs to me that, I mean, while RTI is just hugely critical for kids with dyslexia, for example, students with dyslexia, it really is an important tool to keep kids learning as much as they can. I mean, I would put RTI generally funding for that intervention, or that having that available everywhere for kids in base funding. I would say it's just something that saves us educational dollars later on, because kids don't lose from the beginning. So, I mean, so I would argue not for a particular segment of kids, but that schools ought to have that available. So that would be a must-have for me in base funding, for example. Do you know? And then the base funding things right now just look like personnel and one is facilities. And so I think that in the spirit of sort of universal funding, let's keep it all in. I think we need to think about personnel broadly. I mean, I read a lot of comments that came out of East Tennessee around the importance of paraprofessionals and personal support for students with disabilities. It's low incidence, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it's base funding, but maybe that goes into the weight. Do you know? Because it's really, really critical for those kids who need it. But it doesn't have to. It's not universal, but it is universal for that segment of kids.
Sure.
So that would be kind of a must-have in waiting for me, if that makes sense.
No, I got it. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great point, because David, I'm coming to you next, and I guarantee you that David would say every dollar in my district matters if we can get it to help students. So I'm sure there's plenty of opportunities to have that conversation, Carol, around what matters with the weighted approach too. And those are all things Ginger can document. David, go ahead. I see your hand up.
So sort of piggybacking on Carol, the low incidence students, and I'm at the School for the Blind, right? So that's a low incidence population, but low incidence students are the most expensive students to educate. And it's because of the amount of support needed to make sure that they have everything that they need. So I'm going to advocate again, as I did before in the must-haves, for those educational assistants and paraprofessionals, because I think that is an important piece in that classroom. And we get our most bang for the buck universally, right, among all special education students, whether they're special education students or whether they're gifted students. If there's additional support in that classroom that can help with that, with bringing that student up or help with that enrichment piece, I think that you're going to get the most bang for the buck if we have sufficient a number of educational assistants, paraprofessionals that are paid well, so that we can attract and retain quality talent to fill those positions, and qualified people. But your low incidence folks, and so when you're talking about funding, the formula needs to take into account that specific student, so that if they are a low incidence student, then more funding is going to be placed with that kid, because if because again, it just costs more to educate those students because of the resources and the wraparound services that you need to make sure that that you are adequately prepared to meet the needs of that student.
Yeah, it's a great point. No, it's a great point, David, because those are things that Ginger and I were talking about. That's a universal approach that disabilities or students without disabilities or gifted students, whatever, need that sort of assistance in the classroom. That makes it easier to argue that this is a universal education of universal importance to education funding. Paraprofessionals, assistants in the classroom, those that can deliver for a student, that whatever the need level is, I think that's a universal one that in the must-have category can easily be argued for in probably 15 other subcommittees the same way, to say we need more folks that are in the classroom to help educate our students. Jen, you're up, and then Laura, you can go right after Jen.
Yeah, I'm pretty much echoing what everyone has already said. And I'm in the same boat as Carol, where I'm trying to coordinate in my mind how the must-haves, should-haves, and stuff relate to the base and the weights and those things. So when I'm looking at this list of must-haves, I feel like RTI fits right under child find law. Like, I feel like it really goes hand in hand, and so it could be just right there justified as a must-have. Ginger, can you go back to the slide that showed the base? The title was base there. Okay, so when we're looking at teacher salaries and benefits, so I'm considering base items to be must-haves, and kind of along what David was saying again, I just want to reemphasize that having a fully staffed school is so important. And if we can make sure that we're not doing any kind of bonuses based on incentive, but maybe giving, I know right now in the BEP formula, the way it's structured, there is a differentiated or differential pay plan that districts have the choice to use the certain funds to give a bonus to a teacher that is going to fill a hard to fill position, like an ESL teacher or a special ed teacher, what have you. I think that's a much better way to go about that than to base it on kind of any kind of test scores or any other high outcome incentive, and just making that pie bigger in the base, so that we're funding our students and our schools to be fully staffed with qualified and excited to be their teachers and paraprofessionals, as Carol mentioned too.
Yeah.
So that was my thoughts on that.
No.
Quick clarification,
good feedback.
Jennifer. So when you're thinking about that support for the differentiation, the differentiated pay piece, you're saying that that would be a must-have piece. Where do you see that living?
I honestly, it's not necessarily a must-have, as if we were to just increase teacher pay and benefits to make it a more readily filled position. If we could fully staff our schools at their base pay being high enough to really draw and attract qualified teachers to come and be in those positions, I think that's good enough. But if we are going to try to do some kind of a bonus or incentive, as was mentioned in some of the resources that were shared, I just want to make sure it's kind of on the front end and it's left up to districts, because if we're talking about being universal, I know a lot of districts will have different needs, that they may have harder to fill positions that are different than everyone else. And so making sure it's just tied to getting qualified people into those roles based on the district need and not based on student achievement or outcomes.
Okay, and just a point of clarification on, just for the group on that base part, when you think about the base funding piece, that is really thinking about what are those resources, what are those needs that should be available to all students? And so what are those things we should be funding that should be there for everyone when we think about the base funding? And then when we start moving to those different levels, we're starting to think about how that funding may be changing based on the different groups or what we want to incentivize or really push toward having more of. So that may help a little bit when we think about those must-haves. So we might still have a must-have for weighting, because we want to make sure students with disabilities and gifted students do receive more funds in those areas, or students with disabilities and gifted students are receiving additional funds based on outcomes that we have, that we've identified further down the line. So definitely things we define for this base would be must-haves based on what you all think should be included in that base, but you might also have those that are falling into those other areas as well.
Oh, great point. Hey, Lori, go ahead. And
All
then
right.
I'll go to Leanne right after that.
So 3 quick points. When I look at this base, the thing that I think we're missing, or I know it's not a funding issue directly, but when I see that we want more school psychologists, in 9 years of advocacy, I've not found a single school psychologist in any district that fully understands dyslexia. So it goes beyond just having more of something if they aren't trained correctly. So and perhaps the funding needs to include, the right training for the professionals that are in the school. Regarding dyslexia specific, I will work with Anna between now and our next meeting. That's a very easy financial plan to put together. Frankly, I don't need you to fund AP programs for students with disabilities if they can't read. So, those things kind of build on each other. And frankly, the financial case for properly teaching students to read is very well researched and easy to present. So I'll work with Anna, and I know she'll help me. We'll get that together to define that. I do want to just something I said last meeting that I want to reiterate. When we talk about funding, and I hear, funding for students with disabilities, in many cases, dyslexia being one of these, if we fund it properly in the beginning, we don't need the extra funding in the end. Again, if my child had been given the right intervention in 1st grade when she was identified by me, she wouldn't still need intervention now. A lot of these types of disabilities, if we can identify them, if our school psychologists are trained to identify them early and we provide the appropriate intervention early, the cost to educate them over time is much less. We actually save money.
Yeah, good points. Good feedback. Thank you. Leanne.
Piggybacking, I think what Ann said about fully staffing our schools, making sure we've got all those people and those incentives there. I think it would be good to look at or consider in the funding, when we mention that, money for districts to use for existing staff to add on some endorsement areas so that, if there's an abundance of, I don't know, geography teachers, we have too much geography teachers, there's somehow we are not just incentivizing hiring those people, but somehow we're growing our need. We can't just hope these teachers come out of the atmosphere. Oh, look, here's 14 special ed teachers that are endorsed and ready to go. We need funding to make sure that we can get teachers getting those endorsements. And then the other thing, when we're talking about the AP classes and the things in high schools, when we're looking in rural districts, that access is very strained. So a larger, wealthier district is going to have more teachers in their schools because they have more students. So there's more likelihood of having teachers endorsed for AP or whatever those other things are. I think it's critical that we also look at the idea of those high-end, high-level things from a space of what the district is able to do outside of that. That we may need to look at more funding for AP access. Actually, Ginger, AP access for all, apparently it has to be approved by the school board, and it fills up. So we have students who haven't been able to get in or those kinds of things. Just saying, we may want to look at some poverty related things as we look at these programs, because wealthier districts can provide more than districts that don't have that much money.
Good feedback. Thank you. Appreciate that. We got about 5 minutes. We'll probably need to wrap up here. Again, great feedback, good comments. Thank you for the discussion. All incredibly important. But again, takeaways from this. Ginger, do you mind going to the last a couple slides past this? I want to make sure the committee go back. Whoops, I went way past it. Keep going back. Right there. Yeah, go back to as you're doing your must-have, should-haves. Please try to use this as just a general guideline about, hey, what I'm thinking, does it fit into what we've been asked to consider as far as a definition, must have around, federal or state law, safety, some of the things we talked about. Kind of use this as your gauge on where you're going to prioritize some things as they're getting sent to Ginger and I, because this is how it's going to be used in the decisions. I think for DOE, obviously it's going to be a lot more complex than that, but these are the areas that they've asked us to consider by definition. So please make sure when you send those to kind of look at this as the guide about what goes where in my line of thinking, and put it in there, and we'll certainly make sure that we tabulate it. And then Ginger and I will work to get that back and get that done by our next meeting. I'm on the fence right now about our meeting on the 19th. I know there are several people that I think are going to be gone for Christmas. We probably, I think we'll tentatively still do the meeting. If you cannot make it, well, there you go. She answered it for me. I forgot that we had moved that. So we've got a little bit of time. But if you can still hold yourself accountable to that Tuesday deadline of next week to get some information back over the holidays, I'm not expecting Ginger to be at our beck and call, and I don't think any of us would ask her to be. That would help her in how we do the prioritization. And then, as you can see, we're going to discuss it and then working on prioritizing that. So again, really appreciate you guys. Anna, you can kind of wrap us up and send us home with your comment.
That seems like a lot of pressure. I would love to keep this conversation going. So can we, in creating these, can we email them all out to the group? Because I'd love to see what other people are sending in and to kind of brainstorm back and forth over the holidays, because I think we have tons of work to do. And with this hour-long format, it's just hard to get everything we need done. I mean, discussion of 20 minutes isn't really enough. So I would love to keep that community going over the holiday through email if we can, Ginger.
Absolutely. And I was actually wondering if it would be helpful to maybe just, when the first person emails something over, maybe we can just put that over in like a sheet in Google so people can see what's kind of coming out of that, and, add some things through that so you can see how it's building over time, if that's helpful as well. All the formal recommendations have to be made during the meeting, but any of that other conversation, we can absolutely keep going through email, and then we can also keep things happening over there in Google Drive so that we don't lose anything that's really important to the group.
Okay, so, and we do that by just emailing the whole group, and then it'll magically show up there for kind of formal review? I'll
have to move it over there for formal. Yeah.
And hey, can we just remind everybody too that our emails will be public record? So
yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things, Anna, we need to be very cautious of is anything that's sent an email is public record. Again, that's not a bad thing per se, but be very careful what you send in email, because that becomes part of the public record that can be found in an open records request. So if there's things that you do not want publicized, or people saying my child, this impacts my child, don't put things like that in email, or anything like that can be discovered, because obviously that's personal information and not for public consumption, to be quite frank. So be very careful if we do that.
Maybe it's better if we just send them to Ginger and then she posts them over there, so we don't incidentally loop in anybody who doesn't want to be looped in.
Yeah, that was what I was just going to recommend. Was I think we probably need to just still send it to Ginger, and maybe not to the whole group, and then the whole group has access to the Google Drive, and they can go through there and see that. So I think that's probably what we're going to do. Ginger, we got about a minute before we get booted off. You have anything to wrap up with before we
the
go?
only thing, two things that I have. One is I'm going to just post some questions here in the chat just to kind of help guide your thinking as you try to categorize things that you have thoughts about, our list from last time, as well as these things that are on the PowerPoint. So it says this group, but you can just think about that, from your perspective. The other thing is that charge of really leveraging your community groups, individual people, to submit feedback over to that dedicated email address. And I really want to put a plug in for this. Look for ways to have people submit feedback there, because some of the things that I've heard you all surface through these conversations, you saw in the slides that those may not be things that are really surfacing through the town halls, surfacing through other subcommittees. But I hear the passion from you all that this is really something that you would like to see come out in this formula. And so I think as you're hearing that from community members, have them send that over to that dedicated email address to kind of get your voices heard a little more loudly.
Yep. All right. Well, we're going to get booted off of Teams. Hope everybody, again, thank you for joining. Hope you guys all have a great Christmas and holiday season. Take some time to decompress, get some rest, and re-energize and ready to go in the new year. And we'll talk to you guys in January. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Commissioner. Take care.
Bye.
Merry Christmas.